Sim Captains, and welcome aboard this Pan Am Boeing 707 Model 320. This is the Michael Wilson version for X-Plane 11. It's reasonably priced at about $30, and I was fortunate enough to pick it up for $20. And we're going to run through a power-up procedure, and I'll just tell you few things I like and don't like, and maybe a few little pointers if you pick up this aircraft that will save you some time. First, let's jump into the pilot seat, and we're going to take a little glance up at the overhead panel. If you're familiar with the 737, you're going to notice quite a few items are in the locations you would expect them to be, and a few items are not. Specifically, the battery and the bus ties are not located in the second row, because that is not the pilot flying's job. We're going to go back to our flight engineers panel. You can see we've got an upper and a lower and a desk and a seat. And let's move into position so that we can see that a little bit better. In the upper flight engineers panel, first we will turn on the battery, located here in the center. Battery on. Next, there is no APU on the Boeing 707 with the exception of a few executive models such as Air Force One, some other head of state aircraft, and anybody else who decided to do it. It would be sort of shoehorned into the cargo area. It required an exhaust port to be added, a number of other somewhat irritating features. So we're going to be starting on ground power. We need to look down at the lower panel. This is a little bit confusing. For some reason, this switch here, when it is clicked to hide ground power unit, provides the ground power unit. And these lovely two trucks, we've got a very tiny fuel truck, and we have a set of stairs. One of the reasons I have not made this video from the gate is because those stairs will still show up, and if your jetway is connected to the aircraft, the stairs will sort of be inside of it. It will tell you though, it's kind of hidden, so it's not that irritating, but it's still a little weird looking to see a old truck sticking out of the bottom of your jetway. Alright, let's jump back in. We're at that flight engineer's lower panel. If we click this to show, those trucks will go away. Next thing we need to do is start turning those on. So we're going to look back up. We're going to turn on the ground services with this switch here below the battery. So hold it up to on. There is a simulated power-up sound from the ground power truck outside. The car powers up, and now we've got a power-on bus light. So we're going to first turn on generators 3 and 1, and you'll notice the guard for 3 and 1 switches up together. Procedurally, we're going to do 2 and 4 later after all the engines are on. I'm not clear on why, but that's the way it's done. Next, the bus ties need to be connected. Flip up the guards, connect all 4, and we can close these guards for now. Alright, next we need the bleed air from our power cart. We're going to go to this switch here. It's a little unusual how it works. You're going to hold down with the mouse and then slide to the right, and you can see I'm way off of the switch now, but that is what actually rotates this dial. Now it is pointing to APU, and that is how it will get its power from the cart outside. Alright, so that is on. We are going to peek up here. Our galley power is off. That is good. Next, we are going to go back over to the overhead. You might be familiar procedurally that you would turn on your position lights to symbolize that cockpit is active. You'll notice I've clicked on those nav lights, and yet they do not show. Now the battery's on, that APU cart is connected and running. However, That is not going to operate. I played with this a bit. Oops, sorry, wrong view. Until we have all 4 engines running and all 4 generators on. Just one of the little quirks of this aircraft. I don't know if that has anything to do with reality or not. We are going to turn on the beacons. That does power on. Again, oddly enough, we have power for beacons, but not our position nav lights. You can see both rotating beacons are operating. Alright, let's begin our startup procedure. Now this is where, if you're a real stickler for reality, you're going to have to let go of that for a moment. As with any jet engine startup, typically we would want to spool the engine so that there's enough air flowing through that when fuel is introduced and ignited, it doesn't just sit in there and cook the engine like a small barbecue on the wing. The way this plane is going to be powered up is, or at least the Wilson version, no, this is not how the real one is. We're going to turn on the fuel first. So suspend reality for a moment. We can do this from the flight engineer station. Right here by these blue indicator lights, we have fuel for engine 1, 2, 3, and 4. We also have our normal fuel cutoffs like you would find in the modern 737s down here below the throttles. So you can either click it, you don't slide it, you just click it, and it's on. In the flight engineer station, you'll see the light is out. This switch repeats the function of that one. So we have fuel flow to engine 3. We're going to go back up to the pilot's overhead. We're going to turn on the igniters for all the engines. I flipped up the guards earlier, but those will probably be down. We're going to go to engine start control, and we're going to hold this to the up position. It doesn't actually move to start, it just sits and run, but I am going to hold down the mouse for about 5 to 6 seconds. You can hear a startup sound. I will caution you, if you just flick one of these switches and let go, you might still hear that startup sound, but the engine may not actually be starting. You do need to hold that switch long enough for it to actually spool up and ignite, which is fairly quick. So looking in the third column here, we have our indicators for engine 3. At the top is our EPR, or exhaust pressure ratio. I'm not quite clear if that's really what the sort of neutral position should be, since the engines that are not running are reflecting the same EPR right now. Our RPM on the N1 has raised from 0 to just shy of 20%. That seems sensible. Our exhaust gas is just shy of 600 Celsius. In reality, throwing on the fuel first, it should have just cooked itself to death and be on fire right now. And then down here our RPMs are running, and the fuel flow is showing at about, what, 2,600 pounds per hour. I'm not quite sure why the engines that are not operating don't fall to 0. So there's a few weird quirks on this, but perhaps they reflect something in reality that I just don't know. Alright, next we are going to repeat our engine start procedure for engines 4, 2, and 1. So the startup procedure for the 707 is engine 3, 4, 2, and then 1. And I've seen that order repeated in other things. That is not a quirk of this aircraft. To save time, I'm going to turn on all of our fuel flows at the moment. Go back to the overhead. So we already did 3, starting 4. It's been a few seconds. We'll go look. I believe 4 is running. They come up very quickly. Let me go back to the flight engineer station briefly. Down by that ground power unit switch is this little flight recorder switch. If we flick it on, it gets a lot louder in here. Basically, I'm not sure if Michael Wilson was giving us a open window sound, it is basically the same sound as if we go to external view. So here's the external. You can hear it's almost the same inside. If we turn the flight recorder off, it goes away. Leave it on for a moment while we start our engines. Maybe we'll get a little more jet spool action. So we've done 3, 4, starting 2. Engine 2 has started. Alright, I changed my mind on that. The startup sound was completely buried in the whine of the operating engines. Just need to start 1 and starting 1. There we go, just in time. You can see temperature rising, the RPMs coming up. Alright, we have 4 operating engines. We're going back to our flight engineer's upper panel. We're going to turn on generators 2 and 4. This red light has come on, meaning we need to turn on the inverter. You see the label is underneath. And we're going to switch this bleed air selector back over to the both position, which is in the center. A couple other things to do here. We're going to turn off the ground power. We're going to turn on the avionics. We can turn on the galley. And I'm going to turn off the GPU, so it will go away on the outside. An interesting quirk of the 707, one of the few breaks in its symmetry, is the turbo compressors. You'll notice this little knuckle right over the intake here on engine 4. On engine 3, on the port side, you can see the same knuckle on engine 2. And yet, here on engine 1, it is missing. We've got the straight pylon down at an angle. There is no turbo compressor on engine 1. And from what I've read, occasionally models were built without a turbo compressor on engine 4 as well. And so that would be providing pressure for cabin pressurization, etc., etc. So I guess we're just saving weight. There was no real need to have a 4th redundant compressor on that first engine. If you're wondering, why do we want the other 3? Why not just 2? Why not just 1? Bearing in mind jet engines from the 1950s and 60s were lower powered, so oftentimes we need these 4 engines. But also redundancy for failures was much more of a concern. An engine failure at this point in history would have been not that uncommon, whereas on today's airliners I think it's stunningly rare from a statistical standpoint compared with what it would have been previously. Alright, let's go back to the overhead, and most of the power-up is complete. You can see it's very simple on this simulated aircraft. I'm going to close the guards on those starters. Most of these switches are not actually operable, so we've got fuses above. That doesn't work. The overhead light does turn on. Again, you hold down and pull, and up and up and up and up and up and up. Next, the captain's map doesn't work. Captain's panel does. That's like a foreground lighting on it. On the right hand side, the FO's panel, drag it, it does operate. Next, the instrument lights. I had turned this on earlier. I was playing. You can see over on the right hand side the warning on my yaw damper is getting brighter and dimmer. If we look down, you might notice behind the gauges they're going to kind of glow more here. So it's not quite the backlit sort of lighting we see on today's airliners. Alright, a number of our icing switches here do operate, which we do not need at the moment, but they do work. This anti-skid does work. The wipers do work. They are also rendered from the outside. You can watch those wipers go. I find them a little bit annoying, so we'll turn them off. Certainly not needed. Seat belt and no smoking, these move. We don't get that classic chiming sound that we're all so familiar with now. Cabin crew, that does not work. Ice detector is defaulted to on. Doesn't really seem to do anything. Pitot heat, we're going to turn it on. That warning light goes out. Wing heat, don't need it. Anti-ice all, don't need it. Window heat, we'll activate that. Yaw damper was already on. I was messing with this earlier. That's typically off at startup. The inverter, we already turned on. This switch is a repeater of that switch by the red light over here. See the red light's on. Go back. Red light's off. So this is the same switch, just repeated. This is a true three-man, three-person cockpit. It is really not designed to be by one person. So if you feel task saturated in Zibo or other modern airliners, the Michael Wilson 707 is kind of a nice mix. You have all the flight engineers' equipment. Quite a bit of it works, some of it does not. Enough that you can play with it and have an idea how that should go. But you're not so completely reliant on it that you're actually wishing you had a full crew. On the note of the crew, one of the neat features he's put in here for us is down here in front of the throttle and the trim wheel. We have a crew, no crew switch. Right now we're in no crew. Let's flick it to crew, and you will see we've spawned ourselves a first officer and a flight engineer. When I fly this, I enjoy leaving them on. It's perhaps a little bit silly, but it does kind of seem a little more realistic. It always seemed a little odd to me to have an empty seat beside you. The only drawback I find to this is if you choose to look back to operate the flight engineer's panels, sometimes he's in the way. So let's turn him back off a moment. Spend a second looking at one of the features where Michael Wilson has made our lives a little bit easier, but sacrificed a tiny bit of realism. You notice we've got our fuel cutoffs here, which I won't click because I don't want to restart the engines. But these boost pump switches don't do anything. Our fuel transfer does move. Our cross feeds, this is a very interesting one. You cannot actually turn these. However, Michael Wilson has made your life easier. This fuel selector gauge is going to operate them for you. So you can see as we drag it, be very careful not to turn it to off. Cross feeds are changing positions for us. The simplest thing to do is leave it in all. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 tanks here, so we've got quite a few tanks to keep track of. And again, this is part of why we can enjoy the modern age and don't have to be troubled with all of this equipment, most of which is now handled by technology, and why a two-man crew can safely and efficiently operate the aircraft without needing all of this extra equipment and a person to operate it. A neat little thing I found performing maneuvers that should not actually be performed in this. If you've ever seen the history of the 707, there's been a famous, and it's videoed, you can find it on YouTube, barrel roll by Tex Johnson of the Dash 80 prototype of the 707. Of course, being a sim, I enjoy it to the fullest, so I have barrel rolled Michael Wilson's 707. And one of the funnier things you wouldn't notice unless you were barrel rolling it is the oxygen mask for both the pilot and the first officer, and I've never looked back here, but I suppose the flight engineers. Their tether strap is actually free floating. So when the plane is in a steep bank or rolling over in a barrel roll, this mask will sometimes come flapping past you and back to its position, which I really have to say, those are the sort of little immersive quirks I love to see in a simulated aircraft. Almost an Easter egg, if you will. It reminds me in the Flight Factor 757, I found a switch and was playing with it. Don't ask me why. I was clicking it on and off like a small child. But at one point, the switch broke and popped out on a spring and just dangled there for the remainder of the flight. Such an unusual quirk. Somebody took the time to program in that I actually broke a button in a simulated aircraft by clicking it too much. So enjoy these oxygen masks, take your 707 out and do a barrel roll. It's a blast. Alright, let's look at the rest of our equipment. Down here, this is where things get interesting. We've got a warning. OBS is eating too much of my system resources. Right in front of the throttles, we should have weather scope radar here, but we've got a few things to make your life easier. On the left is a CIVA or CIVA, however you say it, CIVA, and you'll notice the clickable regions, and it is very, very well rendered. It looks quite realistic. This can be operated with an add-on purchase. It's, I believe, a $12 item. It was initially made for another aircraft, but it works with this one. As I understand it, data entry is through this little digit pad, and supposedly kind of a pain. To make life simpler, you have the X-Plane default FMC on the right, which does operate. So let's hit flight plan. I've already kind of preloaded SFO, headed to PHX, which is nonsense for Pan Am, but that's alright. I put that in mostly because I wanted to show you some autopilot features. So let's go down here to the pedestal. So we're just below our throttle quadrant. This is usually going to be at startup in the nav1 position. If you want to use the autopilot features, grab down and pull up, and it will slide to FMS. The next thing you're going to need to do, and this took me a little while to figure out, grab this autopilot switch and flick it to the center position. You're now in flight director mode, so all of the normal things you would expect from flight director, granted with steam gauges you're not going to get that much, and I'm trying to recall if we get indications here in the artificial horizon or not, but at a minimum your map display on where the radar should be is going to display your course. Now this is where the default FMC kind of makes life difficult. I've turned off most of these, but when you turn them on, you can see how overpopulated it becomes for the font size. It is just close to useless. So if we turn everything off but the airports, it's a little bit more manageable. Still not great from a pilot standpoint at a glance. That's not really legible, so it's good to have a hotkey to jump down here to this view if you actually want to refer to that. Next, and this, I'm going to save you what took me an hour and 3 internet searches. When you get this aircraft up, you will notice most things operate the way they should. Heading select will hold heading. Auto throttle will do what you tell it to. You've got your, it's going right now. Better turn that off before we go riding through our brakes. VNAV, VS, glide slope, back course, everything's going to do what you want except for this one, and here was the frustration. You're going to put in your flight plan. You're going to go to click nav, and you can't find the click zone. I'll save you some time. It's not there. This nav button does not work. You can, however, have this hold course exactly as nav would. You're just going to use the wrong button. For whatever reason, the loc button has been set to do nav. It's got a very slender click region. You can see I'm all over it, but it's only the very center pixels. There you go. You can see it's canceled heading select. It says loc engage. That is basically your nav function. So enter your flight plan in your FMC. Go down here, switch the input to FMS, turn Autopilot to Flight Director for takeoff, and then when you're at a safe altitude, to go to command mode, what would be the CMD button on a modern NG 737, you're going to take the Autopilot switch and drag it up. So probably the most important things I'm telling you in this video that you might not figure out for yourself. Loc is nav. Autopilot center is flight direct. Autopilot up is command. Alright, the rest of the items you can probably figure out for yourself, but you can drag the VS with this knob here. You can drag the altitude with this one here, and again you sort of hold down and tug. It's locking me out at 19,900 right now. That's actually nonsense. You can use this upper altitude knob. It should let me go past it. Another way to do this faster, the more you zoom out, you can drag up and away. Again, just a little quirk. It's kind of aggravating to set, and if you switch one of the hold modes or sometimes change things in the FMC, it sometimes overrides this and resets it, which can be a bit irritating. Alright, so at this point we have started our engines. I got rid of our ground power and our trucks by clicking that hide show GPU. And basically the Michael Wilson Boeing 707 with JT3D fan jets is now ready to taxi. At this point I'm going to sign off because we're going to do some other videos where we actually go fly this aircraft, as well as Michael Wilson's 707-420 model with the Rolls-Royce Conway engines. We can skip all this pre-flight on the Conway because the cockpit is the same. All of the operation inside will be exactly the same. However, on the outside, he's got some beautifully rendered Rolls-Royce engines. Just figured for today we would stick with the iconic Pratt JT3D fan jets. Let's see, we've got some nice outer fan rotation rendered there. So I hope you've enjoyed us for our little cockpit startup tour at Michael Wilson's Boeing 707-320.